What if I told you that you were never too sensitive, you were just the only person in the room who was actually paying attention? Think about that for a moment. How many times have you felt too intense, too emotional, too deep, as if there were something wrong with the way you perceive the world? As if you feel things no one else feels, see patterns no one talks about, pick up on behavioral shifts that go completely unnoticed by others? And then, little by little, you started to doubt yourself. You started to wonder if you were overreacting. If you were making things up in your head. If you should just ignore what you feel to fit in better, to not seem strange, to not bother anyone, to not be too much. But here's the point almost no one tells you. Maybe you're not feeling too much. Maybe others are feeling too little. Because there's a huge difference between being emotionally unstable and being perceptive. And if you stop and observe honestly, you'll realize that what bothers you isn't just your emotions, it's people's inconsistency. It's noticing when someone says one thing but feels another. It's seeing the falseness behind a smile. It's feeling the weight of a room even when everything looks normal on the surface. And that's not weakness. That's perception. Carl Jung used to say, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And what many people don't understand, is that some individuals can perceive that unconscious much more clearly than others. They pick up on what's between the lines. They feel what isn't said. They notice patterns that haven't even fully manifested yet. And that changes everything. Because while most people are reacting to what's visible, you're responding to what's hidden. And that puts you in a different place. A place where interactions feel too shallow. Where conversations feel empty. Where relationships feel disconnected. And the hardest part isn't feeling all of this. It's not being able to explain it. Because when you try to put it into words, it sounds too abstract. Too subjective. And often, you're seen as exaggerated, negative, or even complicated. So you start to stay quiet. You start filtering what you say. You start pretending you don't notice. You start adapting. But even then, the feeling doesn't go away. Because deep down, you know. You know when something is off. You know when someone isn't genuine. You know when a situation isn't going to end well. And ignoring that has a cost. A silent cost. Because every time you ignore your own perception, you move a little further away from yourself. And maybe that's exactly why you feel this way. Not because you're too sensitive. But because you've been conditioned to distrust what you perceive. And if that's true, then everything changes. Because the problem stops being how to feel less, and becomes something much deeper. Why did you learn to ignore something that has always been right inside you? And that's exactly what we need to start exploring now. What if I told you that what you've always called being too sensitive is actually heightened perception, but no one ever explained that to you? Maybe you spent a large part of your life hearing that you need to control yourself more, stop overthinking, or that you're taking everything personally. And little by little, without realizing it, you started doubting yourself. You started wondering if you were the problem, if there was really something wrong with how you feel, observe, and react. But what if that's not it? What if what you call too much is actually a capacity that most people simply don't have? There's something very deep happening here. A kind of perception that goes beyond the obvious, beyond words, beyond social masks. It's that strange feeling of walking into a room and, without anyone saying anything, you already sense that something is off. It's noticing a shift in tone, a different look, an energy no one mentions, but you can't ignore. And it's exhausting. Exhausting because you see things others don't see. You feel things others don't feel. And worse, when you try to speak up, explain, or even warn others, you're often misunderstood, dismissed, or even rejected. And that's where the most dangerous question is born: am I the problem? But maybe that question is completely wrong. There's a very interesting idea in psychology that says not everyone perceives reality in the same way. Some people only see what's on the surface. Others can access deeper layers, patterns, intentions, hidden emotions. And when you start perceiving those layers, you stop fitting in. You begin to feel a certain distance from people. Superficial conversations start to feel empty. Relationships start to feel forced. And little by little, that quiet sense of not belonging begins to grow, as if you're living in a world where everyone sees a simplified version of reality, and you can no longer unsee what you perceive. But here's the point that changes everything. Maybe you were never too sensitive. Maybe life trained you, through experiences, through pain, through the patterns you had to learn to recognize, to develop a sharper perception than most. And that's not weakness. That's awareness. But awareness without understanding becomes a burden. And that's exactly why most people with this kind of perception end up feeling overwhelmed, isolated, and often wrong. But what if I told you there's a way to understand this better? A way to transform that feeling of being too much into clarity, direction, and even power? Before we go any further, let me ask you something simple, but important. If you've ever felt this way, out of place, intense, like you're seeing things no one else notices, leave a like on this video. It shows me this message is reaching the right people. And I really want to hear from you too, so comment below, I feel this. Just that. Because sometimes we think we're alone, but we're not. And if you want to understand more about this kind of perception, how it works, and how to stop feeling overwhelmed by it, subscribe to the channel. Because what you're about to discover can completely change how you see yourself, and how you show up in the world. Now let me ask you something, and answer honestly, within yourself. What if the problem was never you, but the fact that you see too much in a world that prefers not to see? Do you remember when you started feeling different? It didn't happen overnight, it was a silent accumulation. Small moments where you noticed something before everyone else. Situations where you felt a strange energy, even when everything looked normal on the surface. That sense that something was hidden behind the words, and yet no one else seemed to notice. And the most curious part is that, at first, you didn't see it as anything special. You thought everyone worked this way. That everyone noticed the subtext, the silences, the averted glances. But over time, you realized they didn't. People laughed at things you didn't find funny. They trusted people who, to you, were clearly not trustworthy. They ignored signs that, to you, were almost screaming. And that's when the internal conflict began. Because when you see something others don't, you have two choices: trust what you perceive, or doubt yourself to fit in. And most of the time, you chose to doubt yourself. You silenced your intuition. Ignored that internal discomfort. Pretended not to see what was obvious to you. Just so you wouldn't seem exaggerated, just so you wouldn't be labeled too sensitive. But that comes at a cost. And that cost is internal. Because every time you ignore what you perceive, you move away from yourself. You start losing trust in your own perception. And little by little, that clarity you once had begins to turn into confusion. This is where something from depth psychology explains it very well. According to Carl Jung, what you do not confront in yourself, you will encounter as fate. And this connects directly to what you're experiencing. Because it's not that you're seeing too much, it's that you're perceiving content that many people avoid facing. Repressed emotions, hidden intentions, unconscious patterns. And when you perceive that, you become a mirror. And very few people are ready to truly see themselves. That's why, often, when you point something out, even subtly, the reaction isn't openness, it's defense. Rejection. Distance. Not because you're wrong, but because you're touching something the other person still can't recognize within themselves. And that creates an extremely exhausting cycle. You perceive, try to ignore, can't speak up, get misunderstood, feel guilty, go back to silence. And little by little, you start to withdraw. You filter what you say. You hide what you feel. Not because you want to, but because you learned that being who you are makes others uncomfortable. And maybe the most painful part of all, is that even when you stay silent, you still perceive. You still see what's behind things. You still feel what wasn't said. You still pick up what no one verbalizes. And that creates a very specific feeling, as if you're living on two levels at once, what's shown, and what's real. And that internal split is exhausting. Exhausting because you have to pretend you don't see. Exhausting because you have to act like you don't feel. Exhausting because deep down, you know, but you can't say it. And here's something almost no one told you: this perception didn't come out of nowhere. It was built. Often, people who develop this level of sensitivity grew up in environments where they had to constantly read the room. Where they had to notice subtle shifts in mood, tension, behavior, to protect themselves, to adapt, to emotionally survive. In other words, you're not like this by accident. You were shaped to perceive. And that completely changes the narrative. Because suddenly, what you once saw as a weakness starts to reveal a much deeper origin. A refined emotional intelligence. A capacity to read the unconscious that goes beyond the ordinary. But then a different kind of question begins to surface. If this perception is real, why does it hurt so much? And more than that, why, even being so clear, does it seem to push you away from people instead of connecting you? If this has resonated with you so far, maybe you don't even need to explain much, but if you want, comment something simple like, "I see beyond," or even, "I feel it first," just to mark this point of awareness you might be reaching right now without fully realizing it yet. Because what comes next will start to touch something even deeper within you. But now comes the part you might not expect, and that might even make you a little uncomfortable at first. What if this feeling of being different has nothing to do with being special, but rather with being misaligned with what's considered normal? Because there's a very subtle, and dangerous, difference between perceiving more, and isolating yourself because of it. Maybe at some point, you started using this perception as a way to protect yourself. You see patterns, understand intentions, anticipate behaviors, and with that, you avoid getting hurt. But at the same time, it creates an invisible barrier between you and the rest of the world. You start analyzing everything. Every word, every gesture, every silence. Nothing is just what it seems anymore. Everything has another layer, and another, and another. And that can trap you. Because while others live experiences more lightly, even if superficially, you experience everything intensely, deeply, and often alone. And here's where a very powerful psychological trap comes in, one that few people notice. When you constantly see unconscious patterns, you may fall into the illusion that you're always right. That your interpretation is the most accurate. That you understand more than others. But, what if part of that is also projection? Carl Jung spoke a lot about this. He said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Now think about it. How often does what you notice in others also touch something within you? How often does the discomfort come not just from what you see, but from what it activates in you? Because perception without awareness can become distortion. You start believing you're seeing the truth, when in reality, you're seeing a mix of reality with your own experiences, your wounds, your memories. And that doesn't invalidate your sensitivity, but it shows that it needs to be understood, not idolized. Because if you don't understand how your perception works, it starts to control you. You begin living in a constant state of alert. Always reading, always analyzing, always anticipating. As if the world is a place where you have to be ready all the time. And that's exhausting in a way no one sees. A mental exhaustion, an emotional exhaustion, almost existential. And little by little, you start pulling away. Not because you want to, but because it's hard to connect when you feel like you're always one step ahead of others. But here's the point that changes everything. Maybe you're not above other people. Maybe you're just stuck at a level of perception you haven't learned to balance yet. Because perceiving too much without knowing how to filter it becomes overload. Understanding patterns without knowing when to act becomes frustration. Feeling everything without knowing what's yours and what belongs to others becomes inner confusion. And this is exactly where many people get lost. They start identifying with the idea of being different, but deep down, they remain stuck in the same cycle of pain, isolation, and emotional exhaustion. And maybe you're starting to realize this now. That it's not enough to see more. That it's not enough to feel more. There's something else no one has taught you yet, something that separates those who simply perceive, from those who truly understand what they perceive. And that's where things start to go even deeper. If this touched you in some way, maybe you can translate this moment into something simple, like, not everything I see is clear, or even, I feel, but I don't always understand, just to mark this point where doubt begins to turn into awareness. Because the next step isn't about seeing more. It's about understanding what, within you, is influencing what you see. Now begins the part that completely changes how you see all of this, because it's not just about sensitivity, nor just about perception, it's about psychological structure. This is where Carl Jung's perspective comes in with almost uncomfortable precision. Jung spoke about something called the dominant function of the psyche. Basically, each person has a primary way of interpreting reality. Some live more in logical thinking. Others in concrete sensation. But there's a specific type, rarer, that lives in deep intuition. Not superficial intuition, but a perception oriented toward invisible patterns, hidden meanings, unconscious movements. And if you've made it this far feeling like you see beyond, it's very likely you're operating at that exact level. This psychological type doesn't see the world as it appears, it sees what's behind what's shown. It picks up intentions, notices inconsistencies, feels tensions that haven't even been verbalized yet. It's as if your mind is constantly connecting dots that others don't even realize exist. But there's one detail almost no one tells you. When this function is unbalanced, it becomes overwhelming. Jung described this as an excess of unconscious material flooding into consciousness. And when that happens, you don't just perceive more, you absorb more. Emotions that aren't yours start to feel like they are. Other people's problems start to weigh on you as if they were your own. External situations begin to affect your internal state intensely. And then you start to lose yourself. Because you no longer know what's yours, and what came from the environment. That explains why sometimes you enter a place feeling fine, and leave completely drained. It explains why certain people exhaust you without doing anything objectively wrong. It explains why you feel things you can't even trace the origin of. You're not imagining it. You're picking it up. But here's an important, and maybe uncomfortable, shift. Picking up on something does not mean understanding it. Because perceiving unconscious patterns doesn't mean you've integrated them within yourself. And that's exactly where the risk lies. Jung called this shadow projection. What you don't recognize in yourself, you tend to see more strongly in others. And the more sensitive you are, the more this intensifies. In other words, part of what you see may indeed be real, but part of it may also be amplified by unresolved inner content. And that doesn't diminish your perception. But it does demand responsibility for it. Because without that level of awareness, you enter a very dangerous cycle. you start distrusting everything, over-interpreting, anticipating situations that may never even happen, and little by little, you distance yourself even more from people. Not out of superiority, but out of exhaustion. And maybe you've felt this. That urge to withdraw from everything. To stay in your own world. To avoid interactions because it's too much. Not because you don't like people, but because dealing with what you perceive in them is heavy. But at the same time, there's a conflict. Because part of you wants connection. Wants to be understood. Wants to be truly seen. Wants to find someone who also perceives at this level, or at least isn't threatened by it. And that inner conflict creates constant tension: open up or protect yourself, trust or withdraw, speak or stay silent. And this is exactly where most people with this type of perception get lost, because no one ever taught them how to balance it. No one taught you how to filter what you feel. How to separate what's yours from what isn't. How to use this perception as a tool, instead of a burden. And maybe now it's starting to make sense, not just the fact that you feel different, but why it never seemed to have a proper place in your life. If any part of this hit you in a way that's hard to explain, maybe you can sum it up simply as, I feel too much, or even, I absorb everything, just to mark this point where confusion begins to take shape. Because what comes next isn't about explaining more. It's about transforming this into something you can finally sustain without losing yourself in the process. Now pay attention to this, because this might be the most important point of everything you've heard so far. It's not about stopping feeling. It's not about shutting down this perception. And it's definitely not about trying to become less intense to fit into other people's world. It's about learning to hold what you perceive, without losing yourself in it. Because there's a huge difference between someone who perceives a lot, and someone who knows what to do with what they perceive. And that difference changes everything. Maybe for a long time, you believed the problem was feeling too much. But in reality, what's overwhelming you isn't the intensity, it's the lack of internal structure to handle it. It's like having access to a massive amount of emotional information, without having a conscious filter to organize it within you. And this is exactly where a central concept in Carl Jung's psychology comes in: individuation. Individuation is not about isolating yourself from the world. It's not about becoming cold. It's not about caring less. It's the process of becoming who you truly are, without being swallowed by what comes from outside. It's learning to recognize what is yours, and what is not. It sounds simple, but it isn't. Because when you're used to feeling everything, perceiving everything, absorbing everything, the boundary between you and others becomes blurred. You start carrying emotions that aren't yours. Problems that aren't yours. Emotional responsibilities that were never yours. And that slowly drains you. Now think about it: how many times have you left a conversation feeling heavy, even though you barely spoke? How many times have you realized you were more concerned with someone else's emotional state than your own? How many times have you tried to balance the environment, adjust the atmosphere, avoid conflict, even if it meant silencing yourself? That's not just sensitivity. That's a lack of emotional boundaries. And when those boundaries don't exist, everything gets in. But here's the insight that changes the game: you don't need to stop feeling to protect yourself, you need to learn not to merge with everything you feel. There's a difference between perceiving someone's pain, and carrying that pain inside you. There's a difference between identifying a pattern, and emotionally engaging with it. There's a difference between seeing the truth, and taking responsibility for it. And maybe no one ever taught you this. Because most people don't even reach this level of perception. So there's no language, no guidance, no reference. You had to learn on your own. And because of that, you ended up developing a way of dealing with the world based on absorption, not discernment. But that can change. And it starts with something very simple, but extremely powerful: observe without merging. Perceive without automatically reacting. Feel, but don't claim it as yours. At first, it feels strange. It may even feel cold. As if you're pulling away from something that has always been natural to you. But in reality, you're creating inner space. And that space is what allows your perception to stop being a burden, and start becoming clarity. Because when you're no longer merged with everything you perceive, you begin to see more accurately. Without distortion. Without overload. Without confusion. And that's when something very interesting starts to happen. You stop reacting, and start choosing. Choosing when to engage. Choosing when to step back. Choosing when to speak, and when to simply observe. And that doesn't distance you from people. It positions you differently within relationships. But there's one detail almost no one talks about. When you start changing this internal dynamic, your environment starts reacting too. People who were used to your emotional availability may find it strange. They may test your limits. They may even try to pull you back into your old patterns. And this is exactly where many people step back. Because sustaining this new way of being requires something you may still be developing, inner firmness. And the question that begins to arise now is: are you ready to sustain who you are becoming, even if it changes how others relate to you? If this touched you in any way, maybe you can summarize this moment with something like, I don't have to absorb everything, or even, I can observe without carrying it, just to mark the beginning of this shift happening within you. Because the next step will show you what happens when you truly own this perception, without hiding, but also without losing yourself. And this is where everything begins to reorganize in a way you may have never experienced before, because for the first time, you're not trying to fit in, you're starting to position yourself. Do you see the difference? For a long time, your sensitivity, your sharp perception, this ability to see what others ignore, isolated you. Made you feel wrong, too much, hard to deal with. But now, it begins to take on a new form. Not as a burden, but as a kind of awareness that, when properly directed, becomes extremely powerful. And here comes a shift that few people access, because it requires courage. Stop seeking validation from those who cannot see what you see. Because deep down, much of your pain didn't come from your perception, it came from constantly trying to get others to confirm what you already knew internally. You saw something, but waited for someone to validate it. You felt something, but needed someone to confirm it. You noticed patterns, but doubted yourself until they were acknowledged externally. And that kept you in a constant state of inner conflict. Because your inner truth depended on external acceptance. But when that starts to change, something very deep happens. You begin to trust what you feel more. Not impulsively, not reactively, but with a different kind of presence. With an awareness that observes, filters, and then decides. And that completely changes how you relate to the world. You stop explaining yourself all the time. Stop trying to convince. Stop wasting energy trying to open the eyes of those who don't want to see. And you start directing that energy towards something far more important, your own inner alignment. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakens." And maybe this is exactly where you are right now, at that threshold between continuing to try to fix the world, or finally starting to align yourself from within. Because when you align yourself internally, the external world changes naturally. People who don't resonate with your frequency drift away. Dynamics that used to drain you lose their power. And little by little, you begin attracting relationships that are more aligned with who you truly are. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped distorting yourself to fit where you never belonged. And that can feel lonely at first. Because there's a gap between no longer fitting in and not yet having found where you truly belong. And that gap is scary. But it's also where transformation happens. Because it's in that space that you begin building something you never had before, an identity based on your truth, not on adaptation. And from there, your perception stops being something that distances you, and becomes something that guides you. You start using it as a compass. To choose better who you connect with. To recognize environments that don't serve you. To identify patterns before getting involved. To position yourself with clarity, without needing to justify yourself. And little by little, what once seemed like a problem begins to reveal itself as a quiet advantage. But there's one final point, perhaps the most important of all. Because embracing this perception, living with this awareness, isn't about becoming superior to others. It's about becoming responsible for what you see. Responsible for how you interpret. Responsible for how you respond. Responsible for not using this perception as a way to shut down, but as a way to become more conscious in your choices. And that requires something not everyone is willing to develop. Emotional maturity. Because perception without maturity becomes judgment. Perception without awareness becomes isolation. Perception without direction becomes suffering. But when you combine perception with awareness, something completely different emerges. Clarity. And maybe, right now, you're starting to feel that, not as an idea, but as an internal sensation that's hard to explain, as if something is finally making sense after a long time. If you want to mark this moment, maybe comment something simple like, "Now I get it," or even, "I'm not too much. I just see differently," just to register this point where your perception stops being a burden, and starts becoming a tool. Because now, the question is no longer whether you feel too much. The question is, what are you going to do with what you see? Many fell along the way, but your determination brought you to the right place. Some part of you recognized itself. Some part felt something, even if you can't fully explain what. And that's exactly why you need to keep exploring this path. Because the more you understand your perception, the less lost you feel, and the more clearly you begin to position yourself in the world. So if this video moved you in any way, if you felt like someone finally put into words what you've been living in silence, subscribe to the channel now. This space is for people like you. People who feel more, perceive more, and are ready to transform that into awareness, not a burden. And I really want to hear from you. Comment below if this message reflected what you feel. You don't need to explain much, sometimes a simple, "This is me," says it all. Because when you express it, you're not only validating yourself, you're also helping others going through the exact same thing realize they're not alone. And of course, leave a like. It may seem simple, but it helps this kind of content reach more people who are in this same process, people who, just like you, may only need a single message to truly start understanding themselves. And now, don't stop here. If you want to take the next step and go even deeper into this journey, I recommend you watch the next video, because in it, I'll show you something that complements everything you've just discovered, and that can completely change how you deal with the people around you. Now tell me, are you ready to understand just how far this perception can take you?